Welcome back to Video from the Ville. I am Professor Greenawalt, and this is Congress and Lawmaking. You find that this next subject area for our Congress course, as you have your PowerPoints with you, is Congress and the Bureaucracy. Let's go through Congress and the Bureaucracy. Okay, you can have your PowerPoints with you on your electronic device, or if you have gone ahead and you printed them on your printer. Well, as we look at Congress and the bureaucracy, it seemed like an interesting place to start with the Clinton administration. You find that when President Clinton was elected, there seemed to be a signaling that this was going to be a new era in congressional history, an era that was beyond the Reagan, Bush Sr. years. It would seem to be an era of moderate government, and that government was going to be streamlined, government was going to be economical, and government was going to be good at problem solving. President Clinton promised the nation, he said what? He said, "I am not a liberal." He said, "I am a new type of Democrat." And indeed, that helped him, in fact, win the presidential election of 1992, along with the fact that he was a Southern candidate from Arkansas, being the governor of Arkansas, and was able to pick up some of the Southern votes that Republicans would have ordinarily received. But he becomes our 42nd president. You find that Clinton proclaims, quote, "The era of big government is over." Nevertheless, he may have proclaimed the era of big government was over, but the national government continued to grow under him and Republican George W. Bush, of course, who's in office from 2001 to 2009. You find that there is small government growth under Clinton. We find there's larger growth in the government under President Bush Jr. because of what? Because of 9/11 occurring 1 year into President Bush's administration. And you find that, of course, this 9/11 leads to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and, of course, the wars in the Middle East. Davidson, in the textbook, makes a very surprising assertion as he gets to the Obama administration, and he's looking at the Obama administration. He says, quote, about the Obama administration, quote, "Today's big government is supported with revenue for a small government." That's an interesting point, but it's a relative comparison, isn't it? It doesn't refer to absolute budget figures or past budget and revenue numbers for the federal government when he believes that this is revenue for a small government. You find that trends in this subject of Congress and the bureaucracy. We find that history has shown that it's very difficult for a sitting president or for Congress to shrink the size, to shrink the role, to shrink the reach, or to shrink the budget of the federal government. We've said this in class several times. Remember, the last and, well, the only president to ever leave office with a smaller budget than when he came to office, of course, is Calvin Coolidge. You find that one of the reasons for this trend, this inability of presidents and of Congress to shrink the role, the reach, or the budget of the federal government is public ambivalence. And what is the ambivalence? We find that Americans of each and every ideology, Americans across the board in terms of ideology, they profess to always want big government off their backs, yet they turn to big government when they need help attaining their goals and when they need help and aid during times of need. The paradox is that while many Americans oppose the idea of big government, they support many of the government's programs. Sort of like many Americans aren't very happy about Congress, but they all love their individual congressmen, don't they? You find congressmen defend government programs that are supported by some of their constituents, and the implementation of any government program requires the creation of an organized bureaucracy. A recent growth of the federal government under both Democratic and Republican presidents has renewed an interest across the country in the 10th Amendment and states' rights. And we have any number of groups, national groups across the country, promoting the whole notion of states' rights again, and of then the 10th Amendment and nullification that can be used by the states. The whole issue of nullification, of course, came about in the 1820s as states who supported slavery sought not to obey federal legislation, national legislation passed in Washington. If they thought it was unconstitutional, they simply nullified it. They didn't implement it in their states. And the interesting thing is we've seen the reemergence of nullification and of state nullification of federal laws in recent years. It starts with Kurt Fordyce, Republican governor in Mississippi, and you see it almost reaching a fever pitch under Governor Rick Perry of Texas, when at a press conference before the Alamo, he steps out from the podium, goes down into the gravel, and takes a staff and draws a line in the gravel and announces that please tell Washington, D.C. that Texas was an independent republic before it joined the Union, and it can become an independent republic again. You find, of course, that the federal government has the right to preempt state laws or impose federal mandates on states. But what has been true in recent years before 9/11, before 9/11 you found as the federal government's budget shrank in terms of discretionary income was very low for the president to take any initiatives. We found at that point in time the president only controlled maybe 19% about of the federal government budget. But we find that up from the end of the Vietnam War until that time, eventually national leaders and the federal government were looking to the states more and more for ideas and for innovation. It wasn't happening in Washington, but it was happening around state capitals. Davidson, in his book, does what? In our textbook, Davidson tells us that each level of government needs the other. That the states realize they need the revenues that the federal government has, and the federal government realizes that it needs the implementation powers of the state. Washington relies on the states to administer federal programs, and the states have relied on federal money, particularly in the areas of health care, education, and transportation. Well, we've had an expanding bureaucracy. We find that our two Congresses contribute to the expansion of American bureaucracy. Expansion occurs as Congress responds to constituent demands, constituent demands for whatever the cause of the day might be. And Congress is responsible for organizing the bureaucracy. Just as Congress and the President share influence over lawmaking, they also share responsibility for the executive branch and for the maintenance of our bureaucracy. The Constitution requires the President to implement the law, and by implication, therefore, it empowers him to run, to direct the executive branch. But Congress has a lot to do with executive administration, just as the president does. Find that Congress has been constitutionally authorized to organize the executive branch and to fund it. Our framers, however, of course, you look back to our Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. Our founding fathers didn't ever foresee the large federal bureaucracy that has emerged. Find, of course, George Washington supervised what? He supervised 3 departments of government initially. A Department of War, Department of State, and a Department of Treasury. Of course, added on to that was the Attorney General. 2 years after that government is organized, you find that Washington supports the addition of a U.S. Postal Service at the behest of Benjamin Franklin. Well, today we find that President Obama and President Trump, they supervise 15 national or federal departments. They have 15 departments, and they also have independent agencies such as the CIA. They have independent regulatory commissions, and they have government corporations. Congress indeed influences the structure and the composition of the bureaucracy. Congress can enact laws that establish or abolish departments or agencies. Congress can instruct departments or agencies to reorganize themselves. And Congress can authorize the president to reorganize on his own initiative or to propose reorganization plans that Congress would need to approve. Find as we look at Congress and the bureaucracy, one of the, again, another check between the 2 branches is that the Senate has to confirm presidential appointments of high federal officials. Congress, in fact, as well authorizes the basic personnel systems of federal agencies. When we decided to pass the Pendleton Act and put the Civil Service into effect, or when under President Carter we abolished the Civil Service Commission, not the Civil Service, but again we abolished the Civil Service Commission and replaced it with the Office of Personnel Management and the department that the MSPB management to protect civil servants from political influence. Congress grants rulemaking authority to administrative agencies, but the Senate indeed has to confirm high-level federal appointments, and this is found, of course, in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. After the president decides whom to nominate, the Senate, of course, has to decide whether they wish to confirm or not. And the Senate does use their confirmation power to wield influence over the executive branch and over executive branch policies. We talked about this a little bit when we looked at Congress and the courts. Well, the president can bypass the Senate advice and its advice and consent role in 3 ways. The president can make recess appointments. Despite past presidents making limited use of intra-session breaks, you find the federal court case of Noel Canning versus the National Labor Relations Board clearly and directly limits presidential actions to intersession breaks. Senators have resented presidential use of recess appointments, particularly if the president's from the other party. How else can the president bypass the Senate's advice and consent role? Well, presidents can name individuals on a temporary acting basis to fill vacant positions that require Senate confirmation. You can just appoint that person as the acting head of the agency. And the third way is you find that many prominent executive branch officials are not subject to Senate confirmation. President Obama interestingly, used something called czars for different policy areas. He used those czars to lead policy initiatives, and they coordinated the formation of policies across the jurisdiction of departments and agencies. At the height of his usage of czars, he had 50 different czars in his administration. Well, the slow pace of Senate confirmations has been used as an excuse by many presidents to use czars, but there are individuals such as Yale law professor Bruce Ackerman. Yale law professor Bruce Ackerman says, quote, "We need to seriously consider requiring approval of senior White House staff positions." So he believed that the Congress needs to extend its power into that area as well. Congressional senatorial review of nominees is so extensive today, and it's so intrusive that many of the most talented individuals are discouraged from seeking or accepting presidential nominations to office. This legislative review process can involve as many as 40 face-to-face interviews. A study by the Brookings Institution has confirmed that this review process does make it more difficult to find good people that are willing to subject themselves to federal appointment. And Brookings indeed studied this for some time. Well, Davidson finally comes down and he says we have 3 concerns about senatorial review. It takes longer to fill full-time cabinet and agency positions. Number 2, we have an expanding bureaucracy. We have title creep undermining accountability. And number 3, the Senate's confirmation process can be nasty in today's political climate. Well, let's go and look for a moment at Congress and the bureaucracy and the personnel system. You find that Congress wields constitutional, legal, and informal authority over the federal personnel system. Despite the creation of the civil service, there are over 2,500 political appointees in 15 cabinet departments, and this number is small when compared to the size of the federal service. Federal service is comprised of 2.8 million civil servants, excuse me, 2.8 million civil servants and 1.4 million uniformed personnel. So 2,500 political appointees is small in comparison to that 2.8 and 1.4 million numbers. Well, the pay in the bureaucracy, the pay and legal standards, Congress can go ahead and they can create retirement programs. They can create special requirements for holding office. They can create personnel ceilings that only so many people can be hired. They can create employee performance standards. They can set wages. They can set benefits. They can set cost of living adjustments. And they create protections for whistleblowers. You find that the size of government has been a very long debated topic. We find that growth of the government is driven by overlapping factors. You have economic crises and you have war that can be both hot war and the Cold War. You find that we have had a bureaucracy that's grown both in terms of its budget and in terms of the number of people that belong to it. What's the true size of the federal government? The true size of the federal government, we can go ahead and we can look at 1.4 million federal service employees, but that doesn't include the postal workers, it doesn't include the military. So you have a more accountable assessment of the size of the federal government is that you have approximately 4.1 million 4.1 million civilian, military, and postal workers, along with 5 million shadow employees who work under federal government contracts. So you have 4.1 million civilian, military, and postal workers, and 10.5 million shadow employees who work under federal government contracts or grants. Congress is also involved with the rulemaking process. Congress creates and funds executive agencies and defines what their legal mandates are. Congress delegates to federal entities its legislative authority to craft the implementing rules and the regulations. Well, when you look, as Davidson wants to wrap up his discussion of congressional control of the bureaucracy, he says that Congress has essentially 7 controls. And the 7 controls of the bureaucracy are: number 1, hearings and investigations; number 2, congressional vetoes; number 3, mandatory reports that are required, that Congress requires the bureaucracy to generate; number 4, non-statutory controls; number 5, the appointments of inspector generals; number 6, the appropriations process; and number 7, impeachment. So Davidson wraps up his discussion of Congress and the bureaucracy by summarizing for us these 7 controls that Congress has over the bureaucracy, and that is important to remember, one of the most important things that to get out of this chapter. If you have questions about this lengthy chapter and this presentation, give me a call, email me, and we'll hash out whatever you need to understand, okay? All right, we'll be coming up with another presentation right after this.
Done.